The rain hammered against the windshield as Detective Sarah Mitchell watched the black sedan speed through the empty London streets at 2:47 a.m. She had been following a routine patrol when something felt wrong about the car ahead. The driver was moving too fast, too erratically, and the license plate seemed oddly familiar. What Sarah didn't know was that inside that car sat Princess Charlotte, barely 19 years old, fleeing from what she believed was a kidnapping attempt. The young royal had been attending a private charity event when masked figures stormed the building, forcing her to escape through a kitchen window into the rainy night. Meanwhile, palace security was in chaos. They had lost contact with Charlotte's protection detail 30 minutes ago, and every second that passed increased the danger. The Queen's granddaughter was somewhere in London, alone and terrified, with no one knowing if she was safe or in the hands of dangerous criminals. As Sarah's police radio crackled with an urgent bulletin about a missing royal family member, she realized the car she was pursuing might hold the key to the biggest case of her career. But Charlotte, looking in her rearview mirror at the approaching police car, believed she was being hunted by the very people trying to harm her. Two women, both trying to do what's right, were about to collide in a chase that would test their courage, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately forge an unlikely bond that would save a life and change the course of British royal security forever. The night was far from over, and neither of them knew that the real danger was still waiting in the shadows. Detective Sarah Mitchell had seen plenty of strange things during her 12 years with the Metropolitan Police, but nothing quite prepared her for the events of October 15th. She had been working the late shift covering the wealthy areas of central London where crime was usually limited to minor burglaries and domestic disputes. The rain had been falling steadily since midnight, creating a rhythmic pattern on her patrol car roof that almost made her drowsy. At 2:30 a.m., Sarah received a routine call about suspicious activity near Mayfair. A security guard at an upscale venue had reported seeing people running from the building, but when officers arrived, everything appeared normal. The guard seemed nervous and claimed he might have been mistaken. Sarah was asked to do a final sweep of the area before the case was closed. As she drove slowly through the empty streets, Sarah noticed how different London looked at this hour. The bustling city had transformed into something almost ghostly, with streetlights creating pools of yellow light in the darkness. She had always enjoyed these quiet moments during her shifts, when she could think clearly about her life and career. 3 blocks from the reported incident, Sarah spotted a black sedan moving unusually fast through a residential area. The car was weaving slightly, as if the driver was either intoxicated or extremely nervous. Her police instincts kicked in immediately. Something about the vehicle bothered her, though. She couldn't quite identify what it was. Inside the sedan, Princess Charlotte was gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The 19-year-old royal had never experienced such terror in her protected life. Just 40 minutes earlier, she had been enjoying a private charity dinner for underprivileged children, an event she had insisted on attending despite her security team's concerns about the low-profile venue. Charlotte remembered feeling proud of herself for convincing her grandmother, the Queen, to let her take on more independent royal duties. She wanted to prove that she could handle responsibility and connect with regular people outside the palace walls. The charity dinner had seemed like the perfect opportunity to show her maturity and dedication to public service. The evening had started perfectly. Charlotte wore a simple blue dress instead of her usual formal attire, and she had genuinely enjoyed talking with the charity organizers about their work with homeless children. For once, she felt like a normal young woman contributing to something meaningful, rather than just another royal making appearances for photographs. But at exactly 2 a.m., as Charlotte was saying her goodbyes to the event organizers, everything changed in an instant. 5 men wearing dark masks and carrying weapons burst through the main entrance of the small venue. They moved with military precision, immediately blocking all exits and shouting orders for everyone to get on the ground. Charlotte's protection officer, Detective Inspector James Crawford, had been checking the perimeter outside when the attack began. Through the window, Charlotte saw him being overpowered by 2 additional masked men in the parking area. Her heart sank as she realized that her primary protection had been eliminated, leaving her completely vulnerable. The masked leader, whose voice carried a distinct Eastern European accent, began calling out specifically for the girl. Charlotte knew immediately that she was the target. This wasn't a random robbery or terrorist attack on the charity event. Someone had planned this specifically to capture her, and they had chosen this venue precisely because her security presence would be minimal. Acting on pure instinct, Charlotte had slipped away from the main group when the attackers were focused on restraining the other guests. She moved quietly toward the kitchen area, remembering the layout from her arrival earlier that evening. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, but desperation gave her courage she never knew she possessed. The kitchen had a back exit that led to an alley behind the building. Charlotte had noticed it when she was given a tour of the facilities earlier. As she approached the door, she could hear the masked men becoming more agitated, clearly realizing that their primary target was missing from the main group. Charlotte's hands shook as she quietly turned the handle of the back door. The October rain immediately soaked through her thin dress, but she barely noticed the cold. Behind her, she could hear shouting and what sounded like furniture being overturned as the attackers searched for her. In the alley, Charlotte spotted a black sedan that belonged to one of the charity organizers. The keys were still in the ignition, as people in this affluent neighborhood rarely worried about car theft. Charlotte had learned to drive on the palace grounds, though she rarely did so in public. Tonight, those lessons might save her life. As Charlotte started the engine, she saw flashlight beams dancing through the kitchen windows. The attackers had discovered her escape route. She pressed the accelerator and sped away from the alley, her mind racing with questions about who these people were and how they knew about her presence at such a small, private event. Detective Sarah Mitchell continued following the erratic sedan, growing more suspicious by the minute. The car was definitely speeding, and the driver seemed to be checking mirrors constantly. Sarah decided to call in the license plate to see if the vehicle was reported stolen or involved in any recent crimes. When the response came back, Sarah felt her blood run cold. The license plate belonged to Marcus Webb, one of the charity dinner organizers, and there was already a missing person report filed for both Marcus and his vehicle. More disturbing, there was now an urgent bulletin about a missing member of the royal family whose last known location was the same charity event. Sarah immediately understood the gravity of the situation she had stumbled into. The person driving the sedan was either involved in something terrible that had happened to the royal family member, or they might actually be the missing royal themselves. Either way, she needed to act carefully and call for immediate backup. But as Sarah reached for her radio to request emergency assistance, she noticed something that made her hesitate. The sedan ahead had begun signaling for a turn, following all traffic laws despite the obvious panic of the driver. This wasn't the behavior of a criminal fleeing a crime scene. This looked more like someone who was scared and trying to escape from danger, rather than someone who had committed a dangerous act. Charlotte, meanwhile, had spotted the police car in her mirrors and felt a mixture of relief and terror. Under normal circumstances, she would have immediately stopped and identified herself to the officer. But these weren't normal circumstances. She had no way of knowing whether the police officer behind her was legitimate or somehow connected to her attackers. The masked men had demonstrated inside knowledge of her schedule and security arrangements. How else could they have known exactly when and where to find her at such a private event? Charlotte's mind raced with the possibility that the people trying to capture her had connections within law enforcement or the security services. As the rain continued to fall and the chase entered its fifth minute, both women were making split-second decisions that would determine not only Charlotte's immediate safety, but the future of royal security protocols throughout Britain. Neither of them realized that the real architects of the evening's events were watching everything unfold through sophisticated surveillance equipment, and that the most dangerous part of the night was still ahead of them. Sarah made her decision. Instead of immediately calling for overwhelming backup that might escalate the situation dangerously, she would attempt to stop the vehicle herself and assess whether she was dealing with a victim or a perpetrator. She turned on her emergency lights and began closing the distance to the sedan. Charlotte saw the police lights activate behind her and felt her stomach drop. She was truly alone now, with no way to verify whether anyone trying to help her could be trusted. The next few minutes would determine whether she would survive the night or become another tragic headline about royal security failures. The chase was about to become much more complicated, and both women were about to discover that their assumptions about the night's events were dangerously incomplete. Forces beyond their understanding had set these events in motion, and the consequences would reshape their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Charlotte's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she watched the police car's flashing lights grow brighter in her rearview mirror. Every instinct told her to pull over and seek help from law enforcement, but the voice of her security training instructor echoed in her mind. When protocols fail, trust no one until you can verify their intentions through official channels. The problem was that all official channels had been compromised. Her protection officer was unconscious, or worse, her communication device had been lost during her escape, and she had no way of contacting the Palace Security Command Center. For the first time in her 19 years, Princess Charlotte was completely cut off from the protective network that had surrounded her since birth. Detective Sarah Mitchell was experiencing her own crisis of uncertainty. The license plate registration confirmed her worst fears about the situation's complexity. Marcus Webb, the vehicle's owner, was not just missing but had been found unconscious in the charity venue's parking lot. With obvious signs of assault, the medical team treating him reported that he had been asking repeatedly about the young woman and whether she had escaped safely. Sarah's radio crackled with updates that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The charity venue was now classified as a crime scene, with evidence of a coordinated attack by multiple assailants. Security footage showed at least 7 masked individuals, all moving with military-style coordination. Most concerning, the footage clearly showed someone matching Princess Charlotte's description, fleeing through the kitchen exit. But there was another detail that made Sarah's blood run cold. The attack hadn't been random violence or even a typical kidnapping attempt. According to witnesses who were now being interviewed, the attackers had specifically asked about the Cambridge girl and had threatened other guests when they claimed not to know her location. This had been a targeted operation designed specifically to capture a member of the royal family. As Sarah continued pursuing the sedan through London's empty streets, she realized she was potentially following either the intended victim of a royal kidnapping plot or someone who had been involved in facilitating it. The stakes couldn't be higher, and one wrong decision could have international consequences. Charlotte made a desperate decision to test whether the police officer behind her could be trusted. Instead of continuing to flee randomly, she would drive toward an area where she knew legitimate law enforcement would have a strong presence. If the officer following her was genuine, they would be comfortable approaching a major police station. If they were part of the plot against her, they would likely try to redirect her away from official help. She turned toward Westminster, where the Metropolitan Police Headquarters operated around the clock. The route would take her through several well-monitored areas with extensive CCTV coverage. If anything happened to her along the way, there would be clear evidence of what had occurred and who was responsible. Sarah noticed the change in the sedan's direction and felt a mixture of relief and continued concern. The driver was heading toward central London rather than trying to escape the city, which suggested they might be seeking help rather than fleeing justice. But the situation remained extremely dangerous, and Sarah knew that backup would be essential regardless of the driver's intentions. She radioed for additional units to meet them near Westminster, but requested that they maintain distance until she could assess the situation more clearly. The last thing anyone wanted was a high-speed chase through central London involving a potentially kidnapped member of the royal family. What Sarah didn't know was that her radio communications were being monitored by the same people who had orchestrated the attack on the charity venue. The criminal organization behind the plot had invested months in planning this operation, including infiltrating communication systems used by both palace security and local law enforcement. Viktor Petrov, the mastermind behind the kidnapping attempt, was monitoring police frequencies from a mobile command center parked 3 miles away from the chase route. His organization specialized in high-profile kidnappings for ransom, and they had identified Princess Charlotte as the perfect target months ago. Young, often appearing at smaller events with minimal security, and worth potentially hundreds of millions in ransom demands. Petrov's team had spent weeks studying Charlotte's schedule and security protocols. They had identified the charity dinner as an optimal opportunity because her security presence would be deliberately minimal to avoid overwhelming the small venue and its guests. What they hadn't anticipated was that their primary target would prove so resourceful in escaping their carefully planned trap. Now Petrov faced a serious problem. His team was scattered, the venue was crawling with police investigators, and his target was loose in London with growing law enforcement interest. He needed to adapt his strategy quickly, or risk losing everything his organization had invested in this operation. Petrov made a ruthless decision. If they couldn't capture Charlotte quietly, they would have to take more dramatic action. He ordered his remaining team members to intercept the chase using stolen police vehicles and equipment they had acquired for contingency situations exactly like this. Charlotte was beginning to feel a small sense of hope as she approached the more familiar areas of central London. The police officer behind her had maintained a steady distance without trying to force her to stop, which seemed like the behavior of someone genuinely trying to help rather than harm her. But she remained cautious, knowing that her safety still depended on reaching a secure location with verified legitimate authority figures. As they passed through Parliament Square, Charlotte noticed something that made her heart race again. 2 additional police cars had appeared from side streets and were now following behind the original officer. This could mean that legitimate help was finally arriving, or it could mean that her pursuers had enlisted additional resources to capture her. Sarah saw the same additional vehicles and immediately felt suspicious. She hadn't requested 2 additional units, and the cars were approaching from directions that didn't match the deployment pattern she had been told to expect. Something was wrong with this situation, and it was becoming more dangerous by the minute. One of the new police cars accelerated past Sarah and began closing distance rapidly with the sedan. Sarah noticed that the vehicle's emergency equipment looked slightly different from standard Metropolitan police cars, and the license plate didn't follow the expected format for official fleet vehicles. Charlotte watched in her mirrors as one of the police cars began moving aggressively toward her vehicle. The car was flashing lights and had activated a siren, but something about its approach felt predatory rather than protective. Her instincts screamed danger, and she pressed harder on the accelerator. Sarah realized immediately that something was very wrong with the new arrivals. She activated her radio and called for immediate confirmation of any additional units that should be in her area. The response confirmed her fears. No additional Metropolitan police vehicles had been dispatched to her location. The cars pursuing the sedan were not legitimate law enforcement. Without hesitation, Sarah accelerated to catch up with the fake police car that was now directly threatening the sedan. She activated her own siren and emergency lights while calling for urgent backup from all available units. The situation had just transformed from a potential missing person case into an active threat against a member of the royal family. Charlotte heard the authentic police siren behind her and realized that the officer who had been following her was now trying to protect her from the other vehicles. For the first time since her escape from the charity venue, she felt that someone legitimate was trying to help her. But she was still trapped between potential threats and uncertain allies, racing through London at dangerous speeds with her life hanging in the balance. The fake police car suddenly swerved toward Charlotte's sedan, clearly attempting to force her off the road. Charlotte jerked her steering wheel to avoid the collision, but the aggressive maneuver sent her car sliding on the rain-slicked street. She fought to maintain control while looking desperately for somewhere safe to turn. Sarah witnessed the attempted ramming and knew she had to act immediately to protect the sedan's driver. She accelerated alongside the fake police car and used her own vehicle to block another ramming attempt. The impact sent both cars skidding, but Sarah managed to create enough space for the sedan to continue forward. Charlotte saw the genuine police officer literally putting herself in danger to protect her, and she finally understood that she had found someone she could trust. But the night was far from over, and more fake police cars were now converging on their location. The real chase was just beginning, and the stakes had never been higher. The collision between Sarah's patrol car and the fake police vehicle sent both cars spinning on the wet pavement, but Sarah managed to maintain enough control to continue protecting Charlotte's escape route. Through her windshield, she caught a glimpse of the fake officer's face and immediately recognized something that made her blood run cold. The man behind the wheel had a distinctive scar across his left cheek that matched a photograph from a Metropolitan Police intelligence briefing she had attended just 2 weeks ago. Viktor Kozlov, the man driving the fake police car, was a known associate of international criminal organizations specializing in high-value kidnappings and human trafficking. His presence in London meant that Charlotte wasn't just facing a random crime, but a sophisticated international operation with resources that could rival those of government agencies. Sarah grabbed her radio while maintaining pursuit of the fleeing sedan. "Control, this is Unit 47. I have a confirmed threat against a high-value target involving international criminal elements. Request immediate deployment of armed response units and contact with palace security. This is not a domestic incident. The response came back immediately with a level of urgency Sarah had never heard before. Within minutes, every available police unit in central London would be converging on their location, along with specialists from the Royal Protection Unit and counter-terrorism forces. But Charlotte and Sarah would have to survive the next few minutes on their own. Charlotte could see in her mirrors that the genuine police officer was now engaged in what appeared to be a deliberate battle with the fake police cars. The realization that someone was risking their life to protect her filled Charlotte with a mixture of gratitude and terror. She had to find a way to help rather than just running blindly through the streets. Her royal education had included extensive courses on crisis management and emergency protocols, though she had never imagined applying them in such a dramatic real-world situation. Charlotte remembered that the safest locations in London for members of the royal family during emergencies weren't necessarily the obvious government buildings, but rather specific, secure facilities that were designed for exactly these types of threats. The nearest such facility was the Secured Communications Centre beneath the Bank of England, a location that maintained direct links to both Buckingham Palace and the headquarters of Britain's security services. If she could reach that location, she would be able to verify everyone's identity and coordinate a proper response to whatever was happening tonight. But getting there would require driving through some of London's most complex traffic areas, and she would need the police officers' help to navigate safely while avoiding the increasing number of fake police cars that seemed to be appearing from every direction. Sarah watched as two more suspicious vehicles joined the chase, bringing the total number of fake police cars to 4. The criminal organization behind this operation had invested serious resources in their attempt to capture Charlotte, including what appeared to be a fleet of stolen or fabricated emergency vehicles and equipment that could fool casual observers. The level of sophistication was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in her career. These weren't opportunistic criminals or even typical organized crime figures. The coordination, equipment, and planning suggested the involvement of a state-sponsored group or an international criminal organization, with resources matching those of intelligence agencies. Sarah made a tactical decision that went against all her training. Instead of waiting for backup to arrive, she accelerated alongside Charlotte's sedan and began honking her horn in a specific pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. It was an emergency signal that anyone with basic security training would recognize as a request for immediate communication. Charlotte heard the honking pattern and immediately understood its meaning. The police officer was trying to establish communication using a signal that would be familiar to anyone with royal security training. This confirmed that the officer was genuinely trying to help and likely had some knowledge of proper protection protocols. Charlotte rolled down her window slightly and signaled back by flashing her headlights in the same pattern. She then pointed toward the east, indicating the direction of the Bank of England facility. If the police officer understood royal security protocols, they would recognize the significance of that location and help her reach it safely. Sarah recognized Charlotte's response and felt a surge of relief. The person she was protecting clearly had security training and was trying to reach a specific safe location rather than just fleeing randomly. Sarah positioned her patrol car to provide better protection while they navigated toward the east side of London. Behind them, the fake police cars were now coordinating their attack more aggressively. Viktor Kozlov had received new orders from his command center: capture the target by any means necessary, including the use of lethal force against anyone interfering with the operation. The international incident that would result from harming a member of the British royal family was now considered an acceptable risk. The lead fake police car suddenly accelerated and rammed directly into the back of Charlotte's sedan. The impact sent her car skidding sideways, and she fought desperately to maintain control while her vehicle spun toward the concrete barrier separating the roadway from the Thames riverbank. Sarah watched in horror as Charlotte's sedan headed for what could be a fatal collision with the barrier. Without hesitation, Sarah swerved her patrol car between Charlotte's vehicle and the barrier, using her own car as a cushion to absorb the impact. The collision sent both cars sliding along the barrier, but the maneuver prevented Charlotte from hitting the concrete at full speed. Both women were shaken but unhurt, and Sarah's sacrifice had bought them precious seconds. But the fake police cars were now surrounding them. and men with weapons were beginning to exit their vehicles. The situation had escalated from a chase to an armed confrontation in one of London's most visible locations. Charlotte looked around at the approaching armed men and realized that her escape had failed. She was trapped with nowhere to run, and the police officer who had been protecting her was now also in mortal danger because of her situation. For a moment, despair overwhelmed her as she considered that she might have inadvertently caused the death of someone who had been trying to save her. But Sarah wasn't giving up. She activated her radio one final time with a message that would change everything. Control. Shots fired at Royal Protection Operation. Immediate armed response required at Westminster Bridge approach. Multiple hostiles with automatic weapons. This is Officer Sarah Mitchell, badge number 40759, and I am protecting Princess Charlotte of Wales. The radio message was heard not only by London police dispatchers, but also by the sophisticated monitoring equipment being used by Viktor Petrov's command center. For the first time, Petrov realized that his operation had been compromised from the beginning, and that law enforcement knew exactly who they were targeting and why. Petrov made a desperate decision. Rather than risk capture by continuing the operation, he ordered his men to eliminate both women and disappear before the overwhelming police response arrived. It was a brutal calculation, but Petrov knew that dead witnesses couldn't testify about his organization's methods or objectives. Viktor Kozlov received the elimination order and began approaching the crashed vehicles with his weapon drawn. Dick Howl! But as he moved closer, he failed to notice that Charlotte had been quietly activating an emergency beacon hidden in her jewelry. The beacon was connected directly to the most sophisticated security monitoring system in Britain, and its activation had just triggered the immediate deployment of the country's most elite protection forces. High above London, military helicopters were already racing toward their location, and armed response teams were converging from every direction. The criminals had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be completely overwhelmed by Britain's full security apparatus. But 2 minutes was more than enough time for trained killers to eliminate 2 unarmed women. As Kozlov raised his weapon toward Charlotte's sedan, both she and Sarah realized they were about to die, unless something miraculous happened in the next few seconds. The miracle came in the form of Detective Inspector James Crawford, Charlotte's original protection officer, who had regained consciousness and tracked their location using the emergency beacon. Despite his injuries from the earlier attack, Crawford had commandeered a motorcycle and raced across London to reach Charlotte's position. Crawford arrived just as Kozlov was taking aim, and his motorcycle slammed into the gunman at full speed. The impact sent Kozlov flying into the Thames, while Crawford rolled clear and immediately began engaging the other armed criminals with his service weapon. The tide of the battle had suddenly shifted, but the most dangerous moments were still ahead. The international criminal organization behind the attack was about to discover that they had seriously underestimated both the determination of the people protecting Princess Charlotte and the full resources of the British government when one of their own was threatened. Detective Inspector James Crawford's dramatic arrival shifted the balance of the confrontation, but he was outnumbered 4-1 and still suffering from the head injury he had sustained during the initial attack at the charity venue. As he engaged the armed criminals with his service weapon, Charlotte and Sarah realized they needed to act quickly to tip the odds in favor of survival. Charlotte had never been in a gunfight before, but her royal education had included extensive training in emergency situations and crisis management. More importantly, she had been taught that in life-threatening situations, passive waiting for rescue could be more dangerous than taking calculated action to improve one's position. She quietly opened her car door and began crawling towards Sarah's patrol car, staying low to avoid the crossfire between Crawford and the criminals. Sarah noticed Charlotte's movement and understood immediately what she was trying to do. The patrol car contained additional weapons, communication equipment, and protective gear that could make the difference between surviving and becoming casualties. Sarah had her own service weapon but had been reluctant to engage in a gunfight with Charlotte so close to the line of fire. Now, with Crawford providing cover and Charlotte moving toward better protection, Sarah could begin taking more aggressive action against their attackers. The remaining 3 criminals were professional killers, but they had not expected to face coordinated resistance from multiple law enforcement officers. Their original plan had assumed they would be dealing with a frightened teenager and possibly one untrained police officer. Instead, they were now engaged in a tactical situation against people who clearly understood combat procedures and were working together effectively. Viktor Petrov, monitoring the situation from his command center, realized that his entire operation was falling apart. The police response was far more sophisticated and rapid than his intelligence had suggested was possible, and his men were now trapped in an extended gunfight in one of London's most visible locations. Every second that passed increased the likelihood that his entire organization would be exposed and destroyed. Petrov made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rather than accepting the loss of the operation and ordering his men to retreat, he decided to double down on the violence. He contacted his remaining assets in London and ordered them to converge on the Westminster Bridge location, with instructions to eliminate all witnesses, including the law enforcement officers who had interfered with the kidnapping. This decision transformed what had been a targeted kidnapping attempt into something approaching an act of terrorism against the British government. The resources that would be deployed in response were about to escalate far beyond anything Petrov had anticipated. Charlotte reached Sarah's patrol car and immediately began searching for additional weapons and communication equipment. She found a tactical radio that was connected directly to the Metropolitan Police Command Center and activated it with trembling hands. "This is Princess Charlotte," she said into the radio. "I am currently under attack by armed criminals at Westminster Bridge approach. Detective Inspector Crawford and Officer Mitchell are protecting me, but we need immediate assistance. There are multiple hostiles with automatic weapons." The response from the command center was immediate and overwhelming. Charlotte had just personally confirmed her identity and location to the highest levels of British law enforcement and security services. Within 30 seconds, every available resource in London was being redirected to their location. But the most immediate help came from an unexpected source. Dr. Marcus Webb, the charity organizer whose car Charlotte had borrowed during her escape, had regained consciousness in the hospital and immediately contacted authorities with crucial information about the attack on the charity venue. More importantly, he had provided details about security footage that showed the faces of several attackers without their masks. This information allowed police to identify Viktor Petrov's organization and trace their movements throughout London during the past several hours. The fake police cars were being tracked through traffic camera systems, and the command center was being located through electronic surveillance of their radio communications. Sarah coordinated with Charlotte to establish better defensive positions while Crawford continued engaging the criminals. The three of them had created an effective triangle that allowed them to provide mutual protection while preventing the attackers from flanking their position. But just as the situation seemed to be stabilizing, 4 additional vehicles arrived at high speed from different directions. Petrov's reinforcements had arrived, bringing the total number of attackers to more than a dozen highly armed and professional criminals. Crawford recognized immediately that their tactical position was about to become untenable. "We need to move," he shouted to Charlotte and Sarah. "They're going to surround us completely." Charlotte looked around desperately for options. They were trapped between the Thames riverbank and increasingly hostile forces, with no clear escape route that wouldn't expose them to devastating crossfire. But she remembered something from her security training that might provide a solution. Beneath the Westminster Bridge approach was a maintenance access tunnel that connected to the London Underground Emergency Evacuation System. The tunnel was designed to provide secure passage for government officials during terrorist attacks or other major emergencies. If they could reach the tunnel entrance, they might be able to escape the kill zone and reach a secure facility. Charlotte explained the tunnel option to Sarah and Crawford, both of whom recognized the tactical advantage of moving underground where the criminals' numerical superiority would be less effective. The challenge was reaching the tunnel entrance, which was located about 50 yards from their current position and would require crossing open ground under fire. Crawford made the decision that would define his career and possibly save all their lives. "I'll provide covering fire and draw their attention. You two make it to the tunnel entrance. Once you're secure, I'll follow." Sarah immediately protested. "We're not leaving you behind. We go together or not at all." But Charlotte understood the tactical reality of their situation. Crawford's plan offered the best chance for at least some of them to survive, and her survival was strategically important beyond just personal considerations. If she died tonight, it would represent a massive failure of British security services and could have international consequences. "Detective Inspector Crawford is right," Charlotte said quietly. "But I'm not going to let anyone sacrifice themselves for me. We modify the plan. Charlotte's modification was both brilliant and terrifying. Instead of Crawford providing cover for their escape, Charlotte would create a diversion that would draw the attackers' attention, while Crawford and Sarah established a defensive position at the tunnel entrance. Once they were in position, Charlotte would join them using a route that would minimize her exposure to enemy fire. The plan required Charlotte to deliberately expose herself to danger, which went against every protection protocol that had governed her life. But it also played to her advantages. She was smaller and faster than the two police officers, and the attackers would be reluctant to use lethal force against her if they still hoped to complete their kidnapping mission. Sarah was horrified by the plan. "Absolutely not. You are not using yourself as bait." But Charlotte had already made her decision. "Officer Mitchell, you've risked your life to protect me tonight. Detective Inspector Crawford has been injured defending me. Now it's time for me to take responsibility for my own safety and help protect both of you." Before either officer could stop her, Charlotte activated the emergency beacon in her jewelry one more time. But this time she programmed it to transmit a false location signal that would suggest she was moving toward the opposite side of the bridge. The signal would confuse the attackers and buy precious seconds for Crawford and Sarah to reach the tunnel entrance. As Charlotte prepared to implement her dangerous plan, the sound of helicopter rotors suddenly filled the air above them. The cavalry was finally arriving, but whether they would be in time to prevent a massacre remained to be seen. The next few minutes would determine whether Princess Charlotte's courage would save 3 lives or result in a tragedy that would shake the foundations of the British monarchy. The young royal was about to discover exactly what she was capable of when everything she cared about was on the line. The helicopters arriving overhead weren't just police aircraft. The rapid response had triggered the deployment of Britain's most elite counter-terrorism forces, including special air service units that typically operated in complete secrecy. Charlotte's emergency beacon had activated protocols that treated the situation as a potential attack on the monarchy itself, bringing resources that even seasoned criminals like Viktor Petrov had never faced before. Charlotte executed her diversion plan with a courage that surprised even herself. Using the crashed patrol car as cover, she created visible movement that drew the attention of Petrov's reinforcements, while Crawford and Sarah sprinted toward the tunnel entrance. Her false beacon signal worked perfectly, causing several attackers to move toward the wrong side of the bridge, while the two officers reached relative safety. But as Charlotte prepared to follow them to the tunnel, Viktor Kozlov emerged from the Thames, where Crawford's motorcycle had sent him earlier. Soaked, injured, and furious about his operation's failure, Kozlov was now operating purely on revenge, rather than any tactical objective. He positioned himself directly between Charlotte and her escape route, with his weapon aimed at the young royal. "You've cost me everything," Kozlov shouted over the noise of approaching helicopters. "If I can't take you alive, I'll make sure no one can." Charlotte found herself facing the most terrifying moment of her life, staring down the barrel of an assault rifle held by a man who had nothing left to lose. But instead of panic, she felt a strange sense of calm. All her training, all her preparation for royal duties, had been leading to this moment where she would need to find strength she never knew she possessed. "My death won't help you escape," Charlotte called back to Kozlov, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You're surrounded, injured, and outnumbered. Killing me will only guarantee that you never leave London alive." What Charlotte didn't know was that Detective Inspector Crawford had been watching the confrontation through a tactical scope borrowed from one of the newly arrived armed response units. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, Crawford was preparing to take the most important shot of his career. He had one opportunity to save Charlotte's life, and failure was not an option. Sarah, meanwhile, had been coordinating with the helicopter crews to establish a tactical advantage. The aircraft above were equipped with thermal imaging and precision weapons that could eliminate the remaining criminals without endangering Charlotte, but they needed a clear shot that wouldn't risk harming the princess. The breakthrough came when Charlotte realized that Kozlov's position, while blocking her escape route, also left him exposed to attack from the helicopter units. If she could convince him to move just a few feet in any direction, the aircraft above would have a clear engagement opportunity. "You're right that I've cost you everything," Charlotte said, taking a careful step to her left. "But you still have a choice about how this ends. You can surrender now and live to serve a prison sentence, or you can die here for an organization that's already abandoned you." Kozlov's response revealed the depth of his desperation and rage. Petrov's organization is international. Killing you will send a message that no one is beyond our reach, not even British royalty. But as Kozlov spoke, he unconsciously adjusted his position to maintain his aim at Charlotte. The movement was exactly what the helicopter crews had been waiting for. 2 precision shots ended Viktor Kosov's threat permanently, while carefully placed smoke grenades began neutralizing the remaining attackers scattered around the bridge approach. With Kozlov eliminated, Charlotte sprinted toward the tunnel entrance where Crawford and Sarah were waiting. Behind her, the full might of Britain's security apparatus was systematically dismantling what remained of Petrov's operation. The night's terror was finally ending, but the consequences were just beginning. Viktor Petrov, watching his operation collapse through surveillance feeds from his mobile command center, made one final desperate decision. Rather than attempt to escape London, he would try to complete his mission through the most extreme means possible. He activated a contingency plan that involved attacking Buckingham Palace itself, hoping to create enough chaos to either capture another royal family member or inflict enough damage to satisfy his criminal clients. But British security services had been intercepting Petrov's communications throughout the night, and they were already prepared for exactly this type of escalation. As Petrov's remaining vehicles raced toward the palace, they encountered roadblocks, aerial surveillance, and overwhelming force that had been positioned hours in advance. The attempted palace attack lasted less than 15 minutes and resulted in the capture of Viktor Petrov and the complete destruction of his criminal organization. More importantly, it provided law enforcement with intelligence that would be used to dismantle similar criminal networks operating throughout Europe and beyond. Charlotte, Crawford, and Sarah were debriefed extensively over the following days, but the full scope of what they had accomplished together wouldn't become clear for weeks. They had not only survived a sophisticated international kidnapping attempt, but had provided law enforcement with the opportunity to eliminate a criminal organization responsible for attacks against high-profile targets across multiple countries. 3 weeks after the Westminster Bridge confrontation, Charlotte received permission to personally thank the 2 officers who had saved her life. The meeting took place in a secure location within Buckingham Palace, with only essential security personnel present. Detective Inspector Crawford was recovering well from his injuries and had been promoted within the Royal Protection Unit. His actions during the attack had been recognized with commendations that would define the rest of his career in law enforcement. But it was Charlotte's conversation with Detective Sarah Mitchell that proved most significant for both their futures. Sarah had been offered a transfer to the Royal Protection Unit based on her performance during the crisis, but she was uncertain whether she wanted to leave the community policing work that had always been her passion. "Officer Mitchell," Charlotte said during their private conversation, "what happened that night changed my understanding of what it means to serve others. You risked everything to protect someone you had never met, someone whose problems weren't your responsibility." Sarah was surprised by the depth of Charlotte's gratitude and her obvious emotional investment in their shared experience. "Your Highness, it was just doing my job. Any officer would have done the same thing." "No," Charlotte replied firmly. "What you did went far beyond duty. You made personal sacrifices to protect not just me, but the institution I represent. That kind of dedication deserves recognition beyond just career advancement." Charlotte's recognition took a form that surprised everyone involved. Rather than simply accepting awards or promotions, both Crawford and Sarah were invited to participate in a comprehensive review of royal security protocols. Their experiences during the attack had revealed vulnerabilities that needed to be addressed, and their perspectives as frontline officers would be essential for developing better protection strategies. More significantly, Charlotte used her experience as motivation to take on greater personal responsibility within the royal family. She requested advanced security training, expanded her charitable work to focus on supporting law enforcement families, and became an advocate for better resources and recognition for police officers who served in high-risk situations. The charity dinner organization that had been the target of the original attack was rebuilt with enhanced security measures, and Charlotte continued her support for their work with homeless children. The attack had been intended to destroy her confidence in public service, but instead it had strengthened her commitment to making a positive difference in other people's lives. Viktor Petrov was convicted of multiple counts of terrorism, kidnapping, and attempted murder. During his trial, details emerged about his organization's previous attacks against government officials and business leaders across Europe. The intelligence gathered during his capture led to arrests in 7 countries and the prevention of at least 12 additional planned kidnappings. Detective Sarah Mitchell ultimately decided to accept the transfer to the Royal Protection Unit, but with a condition that surprised her superiors. She requested assignment to community outreach programs that would help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the public. Her experience with Charlotte had shown her that protection work was most effective when it focused on building genuine relationships with the people being served. 1 year after the Westminster Bridge attack, Charlotte hosted a private dinner for everyone who had been involved in her rescue. Detective Inspector Crawford, Detective Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Sixa, Marcus Webb, and several other key figures gathered in a small dining room at Buckingham Palace to mark the anniversary of what had become known as the night that changed everything. During the dinner, Charlotte announced that she had established a foundation dedicated to supporting law enforcement officers and their families, particularly those who served in high-risk situations. The foundation would provide financial assistance, counseling services, and recognition programs for officers who demonstrated exceptional dedication to protecting others. But perhaps most importantly, Charlotte revealed that the experience had taught her something crucial about leadership and service. "I learned that night that true strength isn't about having people protect you," she said to the gathered group. "It's about being willing to protect others, even when it means putting yourself at risk." The relationships formed during that terrifying night in October had evolved into lasting friendships and professional partnerships that would influence British law enforcement and royal security for years to come. Charlotte had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in her royal status, but in her willingness to stand alongside ordinary people doing extraordinary things to make their community safer. Detective Sarah Mitchell was eventually promoted to lead a new community policing initiative that became a model for law enforcement agencies throughout Britain and beyond. Her approach, which emphasized building trust through genuine service rather than just enforcement, was directly influenced by what she had learned about leadership during her night protecting Princess Charlotte. The story of their shared ordeal became a closely guarded secret within law enforcement circles, but its influence spread far beyond the official reports and classified debriefings. It had proven that when ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, they are capable of heroism that can change not just individual lives, but entire institutions. Princess Charlotte went on to become one of the most respected members of the royal family, known for her hands-on approach to charitable work and her deep, personal relationships with the law enforcement officers who served the public. She never forgot that her life had been saved by people who chose to risk everything for someone they barely knew, and she spent the rest of her career trying to live up to the example they had set for her that night on Westminster Bridge.